My name's Rafi Bloom. I'm the Director of Fundraising and Marketing from a charity, a Jewish charity in Manchester, based in Greater Manchester, called the Fed. And as part of what we do, we're a large social care charity, but part of what we do is run a project called My Voice, and I'm here with my colleague Danielle, who's at the back, and Ike Alterman and his partner Diane. And My Voice is very unique in that it chronicles the whole life stories of Holocaust survivors and refugees who came to this country from Europe, either before, during, or after World War II. And it tells their whole life story. And often when these incredible people tell their stories, it's often the first time that they've ever spoken about it, often in their later years, in their 80s or 90s. And sometimes their families don't even know the full story and horror of what they experienced during the Second World War. So I'm going to start by doing a brief introduction, but before I start, I just want to ask you, by a show of hands, how many of you here know what the Holocaust was? Okay, and if I just take a random sample, you put your hand up, who here has heard of Auschwitz? Okay, and who here knows how many Jews were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust? Do you know how many? Do you want to give an answer?
About 6 million.
Correct, exactly. Okay, so you've heard of the Holocaust, you've heard of some of the places associated with it, but you might not know the whole story. So this is a very brief introduction, and then we're going to hear from Ike Alterman, who has the most incredible story to tell, and who survived 4 Nazi death camps and a death march, and came to this country and built a life and a family for himself. And you are going to have the privilege, and I mean that seriously, it's not a word I use often, the privilege to hear living, breathing history from somebody who lived through the worst crime that we've ever experienced as a human race. So I'm going to start actually with a gentleman called Alex James, who captained Arsenal from 1932 to 1937. He joined them from Preston actually, in 1929 for the princely sum of £8,750. And actually in those days, in order to supplement his wages, Arsenal had to do a deal with Selfridges to pay him £250 a year as a sports demonstrator to get around some of the financial restrictions they had. He won 4 league titles, 2 FA Cups, and Tom Finney actually described him as an inspiration and pure magic, and he's often compared to Dennis Bergkamp. After he retired in 1939, he was invited to Poland to coach their national team in preparation for the 1940 Olympics. And he went there and he worked and he really developed the team. But in early August of 1940, he received a message from the UK Foreign Office advising him to leave Poland and return to England because of the geopolitical situation, because the drums of war were beating. And 2 weeks after he left the country, Poland beat Hungary, who had got to the World Cup finals 3 years earlier, 4-2. A couple of days after that, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Now, why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because most people think that the Second World War and the Nazis and the era of the Nazis and Hitler started in 1939. But actually, the rise of the Nazis and anti-Semitism didn't start in 1939. It started all the way over there in 1933, because that's when the Nazis came to power. And almost immediately, they started a series of propaganda, persecution, and enacting legislation to sort of deny Jewish people their human rights. And they used centuries of anti-Semitism as the foundation for this act. So once they came to power, what did they do? They introduced legislation that denied Jews freedom and rights. So there were boycotts of Jewish doctors, of Jewish lawyers, and of Jewish shops. And then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws further increased that delegitimization of the Jewish people. Jews were forbidden from marrying non-Jews, they were forbidden from voting, and they were barred from all professional occupations, and Jewish children were banned from attending state schools. And then in 1938, all German Jews had to have their passports marked with a J. And then On 9th of November 1938, which is actually 84 years ago next week, so we're not talking about hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, we're talking about 84 years ago. You know, most of you might have grandparents who are in their 80s. We're not talking ages ago. The Nazis initiated pogroms, which were basically organised attacks of violence, where across against Jews in all the Nazi territories. And what did that mean? It was a night of vandalism, of violence and persecution that many actually have described as the beginning of the Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for the Holocaust. What happened there was that 91 Jews were murdered, 30,000 Jews were arrested, and they were sent to concentration camps. 267 synagogues were destroyed. And the night became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, because of all the smashed glass and destroyed buildings, as you can see here, that covered the streets. So we're back in 1939. Alex James, that we've just spoken about, has returned to England. And that was the outbreak of World War II, and Germany invaded Poland. And by doing that, they subjected around 2 million Polish Jews, just let that number sink in, 2 million Polish Jews, including Ike and his family, to violence and forced labour. Thousands of Jews were murdered in the first month of occupation, and the Nazis' first aim was actually to force the Jews to emigrate from Germany, but that had to be reassessed after the invasion of Poland. And then what they did was that they forced Jews to live in ghettos. And these ghettos were specially segregated areas where Jews were forced to live. They were dehumanized, segregated, and controlled. And they repeated this across Eastern Europe. The largest ghetto was Warsaw, where 400,000 Jews were crowded into just 1.3 square miles. Other ghettos included Krakow, Minsk, and Ostrowicz, which is where Ike lived. Many thousands also of Western European Jews, so Jews from France, from Belgium, from Holland, were also deported to Eastern Europe and forced to live in ghettos where they could only take what possessions they could carry. Some of the ghettos had walls around them, some of them had fences, but they were all marked out by poor sanitary conditions, lack of food, rife with disease and malnutrition, and casual executions were carried out by the Nazis. I've heard Ike say many times how he saw Nazis murder babies by smashing their heads against the walls to save a bullet. This is something that Ike has seen with his own eyes. All the inhabitants were forced to wear Star of David. You can't really see any there, but that's a very, very famous picture, by the way, of a very small child who survived, actually.
That's actually very similar to my younger brother.
When he was taken
away,
yeah,
with rifles behind him, never to be seen again.
Yeah, at the age of 9. So then the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. They increased their persecution of Jews, and by December 1941, over 1.5 million Jews had been killed by beatings, starvations, or mass shootings. In 1942, the Nazis held the Wannsee Conference, where they planned the mass deportation of European Jews to extermination camps in Germany-occupied Poland, and this was the final solution, the plan to exterminate, to murder every single Jew that lived in Europe. And if you can think about that, if you can think about deporting all the Jews in Europe, it involved mass coordination and transportation. Jews were rounded up from these ghettos. They were forced by selections where the Nazis decided who to take and who not to take, and Ike will talk about that as well. They weren't put on passenger trains like we know. They were put in cattle carts, enclosed cattle carts with no food, no sanitation, freezing in the winter, boiling in the summer. And often by the time they arrived at these extermination camps, a lot of them had died on the journey. Now, you've all put your hand up when I asked you if you knew what Auschwitz was, and most of the horror of the extermination camps are what most people primarily associate with the Holocaust. But actually, the attempt to murder all the European Jews began with mass shootings by groups called Einsatzgruppen, which were mobile killing units. And they followed the German army as they made their way through the Soviet Union and today's countries such as Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. They massacred entire Jewish communities, but it's also important to note that they also massacred Roma and Sinti gypsies, residents of mental institutions, disabled people, those people also suffered at the hands of the Nazis in many, many horrific ways, and many of them, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of them were murdered. So Jews were, these were the transports, as you can see, forced onto cattle cars. You know, this wasn't a passenger train at all. And then most Jews weren't actually gassed to death. Most Jews were actually shot to death. And they were marched from outside their cities to pits outside, where they were shot and buried in mass graves. By the end of 1941, more than 1 million Jews had been killed by these mobile killing units, murdered by these mobile killing units. Then the Nazis decided that they have to get a bit more efficient in the way they were doing it. Amazingly, they were worried at the mental cost to their soldiers of killing Jews like that. So they thought, okay, we've got to worry about our soldiers murdering millions of Jews, shooting women and children, so we need to develop more efficient methods, and they developed gas chambers. The first gas chambers were vans that were pumped full of carbon monoxide, but then they built proper gas chambers and they expanded it to a sort of a 6 concentration camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor and Treblinka. Treblinka, 900,000 Jews were murdered, including Ike's mother, brother and sister. They were simply there to carry out genocide, to carry out mass murder. This is the picture of the railway tracks to Birkenau, where the transports came in. These are prisoners in Birkenau. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis created 40,000 camps, forced labour, transit, extermination camps. And inmates were subject to cruelty, lack of food, poor sanitary conditions, cruel treatment, and a lot of people died from that as well. So Auschwitz-Birkenau, which we just saw, was where 1.3 million Jews were murdered. Transports of Jews arrived daily from across Europe. And by the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered by the Nazis. So what you're about to hear from Ike now is first-hand testimony from someone who was born in Poland before the war, lived in a Nazi-controlled ghetto, survived much of what you've just heard, including 4 death camps and a death march. What we want you to do is listen to his story, ask questions afterwards. There's nothing that you can't ask him about his life's experiences or about how he views the world today. You know, we are living through an age where Russia has invaded the Ukraine under the pretext of calling the Ukrainians Nazis. This is a gentleman who experienced the real Nazis. So any questions that you have about tolerance, about hate, about hope, about what he experienced, how he got through it, please feel free to ask him. But it is, as always, my great honour to introduce my dear friend Ike Alterman, who really is the most incredible person that I have ever met.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me, but at my age, hearing aids and all sorts. I'll start off. My name was Ike Alterman, which was very difficult for non-Jewish people to pronounce. So I started calling myself Ike Alterman, make things easier for other people to understand. I was born in Ożarów. That was my mother's hometown. Her name was Chava Sora. In southeast Poland in 1928. I had an older sister, Fega, and a younger brother, Pinkos. I remember that my father, Zacharias Feivel, had the first motorized taxi in the town. The car had a big horn on the driver's side of the car, and I loved to hoot it. Yeah. When I was still young, we moved to my father's hometown called Ostrowiec, which was approximately 25 kilometers away, so he could work in the family business. As well as working in the family business, My father would go to the capital of Poland, called Warsaw, to buy the parts, and he would assemble and sell racing bikes from our front room. Now, they weren't just ordinary racing bikes. They were specialized because on the continent, from Poland, Austria, Germany, etc., that was a pastime. They used to have races. Now, some of the bikes, listen to this. So he brought things from Warsaw to buy the parts and would assemble and sell the racing bikes from our front room. The wheels were wooden, so that the bikes would be light, and the tires were stamped made in England. I couldn't read in England. So we in Poland, we used to pronounce it Made in England. I didn't know what that meant, England. I started Hebrew schools at 3 years old. I hated it, and very often my father dragged me through the streets, shouting and screaming to attend school. Children started Polish schools at 7 years old. And so I had 2 years of secular schooling. That was it. Everything changed in September of 1939 when war broke out. All Jewish businesses were closed, and work, food, education were restricted. A ghetto was formed in 1941. In a small area of the town and around where we lived, more and more people arrived from local towns, and there were 16,000 people at any one time. German soldiers raided the ghetto regularly and took people away. They were never seen again. In autumn 1942, all Jews were ordered to report to the town square. We were allowed to take with us only what we could carry in our hands. We were lined up in the square 4 or 5 rows deep, and we were kept standing for hours, fearful of what was awaiting us. I was standing behind my father, who told me to stand on my tiptoes. So I would look older and taller. My mother, my sister, and my little brother were standing next to my father. The German officer started to count the rows and stopped between my father and my mother. His arm went down like that, and all those to the left of my father were marched out of the square, followed by guards with rifles. That was the last I saw of my mother, my sister, my brother. That was the last I saw of my sister. They were taken straight to Treblinka, a death camp, to be exterminated. My father and I were sent to work in the brickworks, and we slept on straw on the floors. I was only 13 years old, and life had changed beyond all recognition. One day when there was a raid on the ghetto, I was separated from my father and sent to Blizhin, my first concentration camp, at 13 years old. If I thought the ghetto was bad, I was in for a real shock. In the camp there were many appels, which meant we were lined up in the open air and left to stand for hours while the Nazis did a roll call, sometimes in dreadful conditions. In 1944, I was transported to Auschwitz and then marched to Birkenau. The following morning, I was tattooed with my number. I was not Ike Alterman anymore. I was B1209. I remember the dreadful stench of burning flesh and can vividly remember the 4 chimneys glowing red night and day. I soon found out these came from the 4 crematoriums where they were burned the bodies of the Jewish who were murdered upon arrival in the gas chambers. I also remember witnesses' bodies being buried in open mass graves and covered with lime poured on them after they had been killed. One of my first jobs was to collect the clothing of the murdered prisoners and deliver them to the Nazis so anything of value could be kept by them. I was then picked to work on a small farm which provided food for the officers and guards. The morning before Christmas, we were sent out in the bitter cold to pick sprouts for part of the officers' Christmas dinner. We had no proper shoes or warm clothes, and snow was very deep, and we were frozen to the bone. In the evening, the German political civilian who was in charge of our barrack ordered us to sit on our bunks and sing Silent Night, which was Heilige Nacht, Ruhe Nacht, alles Ruhe, alles wach. That was in German. For which we received a ladle of water with a couple of sprout leaves floating in it. That was our Christmas bonus. Needless to say, I have never been able to face sprouts to this day, as it brought back all the bad memories. In January 1945, I was one of 6,000 prisoners who were marched out of Auschwitz through deep snow. Anyone who couldn't keep up was shot and left on the side of the road. Only a few hundred survived, and we ended up in Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. In the middle of April, we were loaded onto open cattle trucks with guards on all 4 corners of each truck were transported. We journeyed wherever the train could go, as a lot of the railway lines were being bombed by the Allies. On the 8th of May, we arrived in Theresienstadt, which was then in Czechoslovakia. Yet another camp. Many people died en route, and those who were still alive were due to go to the gas chambers the following day, myself included. That was not to be. As the war had ended that day and we were liberated by the Russian army, we were free. Remember, not knowing what the word free meant, as I had not tasted freedom for so long. The Jewish Refugee Committee approached the British government and asked if they could bring over some of our orphan children to England. Permission was given for 1,000 children. They had to be under the age of 16, and the Jewish Refugee Committee were to be responsible for all their needs, for all our needs. You would think this was a great achievement, but would you believe it? They only managed to find 732 surviving children. None of the survivors had any papers to prove our ages, so some of us gave false dates to enable us to be eligible for transportation. 3 months later, I was on the first transport of 300 children flown from Prague in a Lancaster bombers, destination Carlisle. You know, they removed all the equipment on these Lancaster bombers, so we all sat on the floor. But we didn't know what was happening. When we arrived in Carlisle, we were taken into an airport hangar where tables were set with plates of bread with butter and jam and tea with milk, something we never had at home but soon got used to. Food into our pockets, we stuffed them because we didn't know when we were going to get another piece of bread. As long as we never knew when we would get next piece of bread, we were driven to Windermere and taken to a campsite near the lake. We thought we were in paradise. We were each taken to a chalet, given a room with our own bed, with sheets and pillow, hot showers and a proper loo. The next morning we showered, put on our new underwear and clothes and were taken to the main hall where we said our morning prayers and breakfast was served. Food, the likes of which we hadn't seen since before the war in 1939. We couldn't believe our eyes at all this food. It took us time to stop stuffing our pockets as soon as we saw food. Our minds were still fearful, and we were worried where the next meal would come because of the fear we had in the camps. All the staff, many of whom were locals, were friendly and helpful and caring for us. I know how they were shocked at the appearance and terribly sad when they saw how starved we were and the survival tactics that had become normal life for us. We started to learn to live again. And many boys went swimming in the lake. We played football. We were taken on the steamers on the lake. There were outings to Bowness and other parts of the Lake District. We learned to explore the area. We went to the cinema and we walked for miles in freedom. What a wonderful time it was. We stayed in Windermere for 3 months, learning to adjust to a new life. We formed friendships which have lasted to this day. We were known as the Holocaust surviving children. Later it was shortened to the boys, and now I am a Windermere boy. I'm still in contact with my friends. They are all over the world, but unfortunately, many have now passed on. We have an unbreakable bond, having survived the worst example of human behavior this world has ever seen. When we left Windermere, we were sent to a hostel in various towns to start to build a life for ourselves, together with about 30 of the boys and girls. I came to Manchester and I have lived there ever since. We were encouraged to look for work, and I started to work in a garage, learning to repair tractors. After a while, I decided to get a job in the jewelry trade. As a young boy back home in Poland, I used to watch my uncles, who were in the jewelry trade, melting down old wedding rings with a blowtorch and turning them into liquid gold to make something new. In those days, everything was done by hand. So becoming a jeweler was like sawdust to the clowns. It got into my blood. I found myself a job and started to learn the trade. After a while, I moved to a bigger and better company where I was working there. I made myself a little bench at home, and I asked my boss to give me some work to take home. Some evenings, I worked till 10, 11 o'clock at night to earn an extra couple of pounds. Eventually, I opened my own workshop, doing repairs and remakes for the jewelry shops. I employed several skilled craftsmen and I built up a successful business. And I had a very good name in the trade because of the high standard of work we produced. I retired from business when I was 73 years old. I was lucky to meet a lovely girl called Myra. We were happily married for over 30 years when unfortunately she passed away young. I have 2 wonderful daughters, 2 grandchildren. 7 years after my wife died, I met my present partner, Diane. And we have been together for 25 happy years now. I've learned something from everything I've looked, and everything I have been through. That's my education. I have never harmed anybody. I have never done anybody for a shilling. I don't owe any money to anybody. So I must have done something right. I'm getting by. I am not starving, and my children are not starving. I always wanted my children to have a better life than me. Unfortunately, I can't erase some of my bad memories. They will always be with me till the day I die. I've had some good things happen as well, so I try to balance it out as best as I can. I've learned to live and appreciate what I have. No one is immortal, and as the years pass, there is a danger the Holocaust will recede in history. This must not happen. We must never forget that man is capable of, and so we must pass on the warning from generation to generation. It's why I say to all of you, please remember my story. Remember the family I lost, and remember the 6 million who were slaughtered simply because they were Jews. Because if you don't remember, then who will? Thank you for listening to me. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Sit down. I can answer the questions sitting down. Wow, every time I hear that story, and I've heard it many times, it's still one of the most incredible things I've ever heard. So we'd like to encourage you and ask you to ask questions about anything that Ike has told you, about his experiences, about the war, about his life after the war. Feel free. Anybody want to go first? Don't be shy.
Mike, you've only got a question.
I've always got a question, but I'm still trying to absorb a lot of that. There was an awful lot. Thank you so much, Ike, for sharing that with us, and so brilliantly and amazing that you can add such humour to it at times as well. For us in this environment, what would be your advice to these boys in terms of how they should look at life, and that they're desperate to try and achieve what is quite a difficult and impossible task at times, a career in professional football, but they have a small opportunity to achieve that. What would be your advice to anyone who feels that they might not be successful, or life's too challenging, or they're up against it?
What would be your advice to this group of young men about how they should approach life if they find life too challenging? What lessons should they learn from your story and from life?
Well, the only thing I can say to you is go through your life, be good to other people. Most important, to be good and help people who are beneath you, people who are
not as strong.
not as strong as you young people, help them, look out for them, because life is very, very short, really. I'm 94 years old, nearly 95 years old, and remember, you can't tell from day to tomorrow what's going to happen in life. So be good citizens. Look after each other. Look after other people, which is very, very important. And look out for some of the terrible things that I've seen through the Holocaust. It can happen again if we're not aware of it. When you find yourself in a position where people try to deny things like that ever happened, be open and make sure, because you're young, you've got a future in front of you, you've got all that to go through yet. So be aware of what I've been through. And make sure that you have a good life yourselves as well. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think it's very hard.
One of the questions that Ike often gets asked is, and you've heard about the Holocaust, you heard from me about the rise of Nazism in Germany, you've seen and heard firsthand what the Nazis did to Jewish people and to many other people. And one of the questions Ike often gets asked is, do you hate all Germans?
No. No matter what they've done, I cannot say I hate all Germans. For the simple reason, as far as I can see, if I were to hate all Germans, I would be preaching the same as Hitler did, to exterminate all Jews. How can you hate all people? Some of these people, the German people, weren't even involved, they weren't even born. So how can I preach to say, yes, I hate the Nazis for the things that they created and the things that they did, but can't hate all people. You see, this was a thing that the German did. They hated all Jews. They wanted to exterminate all Jews. There were some people who were educated people, clever people, doctors, politicians, all people with so much knowledge that they had to give to the world. And they've done away with all this. How? It's very, very unfair. Very unfair. But you can't turn around and hate the whole world because what they did. Only the Nazis.
I think that's quite a... Go on.
I was just going to say, what kept you so strong throughout it all?
Sorry?
What kept you so strong throughout it all?
What's kept me strong after all this? I think that I came to live in England and got a second chance in life. And I'm forever grateful to the British government and the British people who haven't had that opportunity, because I could have been exterminated any time. Every day I thought tomorrow, whether I was in Birkenau or I was in Auschwitz or whatever, you never knew from day to day. or even the same day, whether you're going to survive. The fear, the pressures, were there all the time. But the one thing I think some people may not agree with me, I believe that my late mother was my guardian angel. And she looked after me. Yes, I was recently, as the 3rd of August of this year, with a trip with Rafi and some friends. We went to Treblinka, to where my mother, my brother, my sister, my whole family, on my father's side, my whole family, on my mother's side, they all perished there. And we went to pay respect, to find not even a grave. No, they're just a piece of a rock, just with the name of the town. That's all. The bodies were done away with.
Treblinka is a camp where, as I mentioned at the beginning, where 900,000 Jews were murdered. And there's a stone there. There's 17,000 stones there, and each one represents a village, a town, or a city from where Jews were transported on trains in cattle cars by the Nazis to Treblinka, and initially shot upon arrival and buried in mass graves. And then in around 1942-43, even then the Nazis realized they were losing the war. They dug up all these bodies and burnt them on top of railway sleepers. So when we went back there are no graves, as Ike said. There's just the ashes are buried in the ground. Some of the bodies are buried in the ground. It's just a mass graveyard of 900,000 people. And sometimes that's a number that's impossible to comprehend. But imagine that's, 15 times the capacity of Old Trafford. Jews murdered and buried in one place. And you can try and get a sense of the enormity of it. It's hard, but that's the only way sometimes that you can realise that. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, what I'd like to say then is thank you for listening. Can I ask you a question? Have you heard things today that perhaps you didn't know about, or that perhaps have given you a greater depth of understanding of the Holocaust of 1939 to 1945, and even actually the period before the war? Because what's important to remember is that what happened to the Jews in Germany and in Europe started in a very civilized society. Germany in 1930 was a modern, forward-thinking Western society, with doctors and lawyers and accountants and politicians and philosophers. And what happened there happened very quickly. It didn't happen over 100 years. It happened over a period of 5 or 6 years, from the denial of people's basic human rights all the way through to mass murder on an industrial scale. And I think that's a lesson for all of us to learn. All of us, I'm sure, have experienced or seen racism and xenophobia in our lives, some to a greater or lesser degree. But I think what's important is the message of tolerance that Ike talked about, which is that he doesn't hate all Germans. He wouldn't, because that would make him as bad as the Nazis. And I think we have to have, if there's one thing to take away from this, apart from hearing this incredible testimony, so that next time somebody might say to you, well, the Holocaust wasn't quite as bad as that, or it was a small thing in history, you can turn around and say, you've heard first-hand testimony of the horrors and the cruelty and the scale of the Holocaust from somebody who survived it. And somebody who survived it from the age of about 11 to 16. So some Some of you guys, I don't know the ages, are you between 16 and 18? At that age, can you imagine not knowing from one day to the next whether you would live or die, whether you'd be shot, whether you'd be sent to a gas chamber, being forced to march in freezing snow, and if you can't carry or you stop or you fall asleep, you get a bullet in your head? So it's really important that you take that testimony with you throughout your lives and say, I've heard it firsthand. That's the first thing. The second thing is that whenever we're faced with racism or intolerance, that we stand up to it. Doesn't matter who's doing it or what form it takes. Ike's message is we're all human beings. Be good to each other, be kind to each other, treat each other with respect. Because if Ike can survive what he's done and have that positive attitude and that desire to do good and not harm anybody and build a life for himself and overcome the struggles that he's overcome, then the other that message is we should all be able to do that as well. And the other message is that no matter how hard you might find something in your life as you go through your careers, nothing is insurmountable, because if Ike can survive what he did and build the life that he did, then we can all overcome any obstacles that are put in our way. And if those are the abiding memories and thoughts that you take away from this, then I think it's been a good session.